Equal opportunity that underpins the promise of democratic nations begins with access to a decent education. But that's not what's happening, according to writer Fredrik deBoer. His new book is called The Cult of Smart: How Our Broken Education System Perpetuates Social Injustice. And Fredrik deBoer joins us now from Brooklyn, New York to explain. It's great to meet you. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing, Steve?
Just great. Thank you so much. I want to start with an excerpt from your book and then we'll chat. This book is my prayer, you write, for the untalented, an attempt to show how badly our society and its people are hurt by the obsessive focus on schooling and smarts. We can build a better future, but only if we are willing to think clearly and speak frankly about who succeeds in the current system and why. Okay, let's start there. And let's be clear about what you're saying and perhaps what you're not saying here, more importantly. Are you saying that we shouldn't be encouraging people to go as far in their educational lives as they possibly can?
No, I think that people should pursue education. What I think that we need to do is we need to diversify or really re-diversify what it means to be an educated person and the type of things that we are teaching in K through 12 schools and colleges and other contexts. I think that it's really important to understand that there has in the last 30 or so years, particularly in America, but in other places like Canada, there's been a transformation in how we define success in schools. So now we see the educational outcomes and educational excellence in quantitative terms, right? The obsession in the American educational policy world is GPAs, SAT scores, state standardized test scores, graduation rates, right? It's all numbers. This is actually a very new phenomenon. If you go back to 1970, in many places in the United States, parents would receive almost no quantitative information about how their student is doing in school. They would get report cards, and the students would get grades in those in their classes, A, B, C, D, F, and they probably care about those grades. But in many contexts, they wouldn't even be reporting an overall GPA. They wouldn't be averaging the GPA up. In many contexts, these students would be taking no state standardized tests or very minimal testing. At this point, the participation rate in the SAT in many states was very low. I mean, often less than 10%. Class rank was often not computed at this time. There were not states giving schools or school districts report cards, as often happens in American education now. So there was just a great deal less of quantitative information to say that, this student is doing well, this school, this district is doing well. And that change has, in my opinion, come with it a narrowing down of what we mean when we say, an effective student, a quality student, an excellent student. That before everything became reduced to numbers, that there was a sense in which there were values that we were trying to spread in our schools that were not quantitative in measure. Things like patience, kindness, sociability, creativity, etc. I think that the obsession with numbers has created a situation in which we no longer respect the diversity of ways that students can be excellent.
Well, maybe this is a good time for that anecdote that I read in your book. This goes back to a time when you were teaching in public schools. You're trying to teach a kid long division, and he just couldn't get the hang of it. Seemed like the end of the world for him. I just can't get it, he said. What's the kind of newer, better approach that you think we ought to have been taking as opposed to how we might traditionally handle that situation?
Sure. So the answer is not this kid should not be taught long division. That's not the point, right? The point is that right now, and increasingly, due to more and more policies to this effect, we have a narrow set of criteria through which students can pass from one grade to the next, or they can earn their diploma. And this is particularly true in high school. So high school, especially with the adoption of the Common Core standards, has seen more and more strict rules about what it takes to be able to advance through the system. And so you take this kid who's struggling in long division. Right now, in many K through 12 contexts, he'll have the ability to pass to the next grade and to continue to develop those skills as he ages up. But if you get to high school, you have a lot of kids who, for example, can't pass their algebra requirement. And if they don't pass their algebra requirement, they cannot move to the next level in school. So this is a problem just theoretically, but it's also a problem because we look at, for example, there are states such as Arizona where it has happened in the past where something like 65% of their students are failing to meet their math requirements, 65%. And so you have this major stopgap that's keeping people from advancing in their careers. It's also a problem because we know that an inability to pass to the next grade is a major driver of dropouts. Because if you're a typical 16-year-old, and you grew up with a cohort of kids, and you moved through school with them, and then all of a sudden you are now being left behind, and you have to spend all of your time with kids who are a year younger than you. That is in many ways destabilizing and insulting and degrading, and so it's not surprising that a lot of kids drop out in that scenario. What I'm advocating for is not that we say, oh, this kid can't do math, let's give up. But I am saying that if we loosen these standards, if we give students a bigger set of options for how they can progress, we'll be acknowledging the fact that different students have different strengths. And we'll be expressing to all of our young people, hey, look, there's lots of ways to be a useful person, to be a valuable person. So a good example is if you can't pass your algebra requirement, your algebra 2 requirement, which is a really big one. Or in college, often it's organic chemistry is another big filter class, they call them, or weed out class. How about we provide alternatives that test some of the same skills, but that are more flexible for different kind of learners? So instead of having to pass algebra 2, maybe you can pass a quantitative reasoning class. And that's the kind of class where you learn introductory statistics. You learn to think through problems with numbers. You look at real world scenarios. And that way you're still teaching math skills and you're still preparing someone from a world in which they want to be numerate, but where you're broadening the options available to everyone. And I think that's particularly true because the simple fact of the matter is many people don't use abstract math in their day-to-day life ever. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't make sense to make that a strict requirement for graduating from high school because you're hurting a lot of lives, and I don't really particularly see what the educational advantage of doing that is.
No, I take your point, but I think I may have taken a different lesson from that kid who couldn't do algebra as well, which speaks to I think a bigger point that you're trying to make in your book. And it's a difficult point. It's a point that is fraught with well, in fact, I'll read the quote. This is what you say. The kid who couldn't do long division, he just didn't apparently have the natural aptitude to do the long division. And you say to talk frankly about natural academic talent is to wander into a minefield. So tell us about what some of those mines in that field you're referring to are.
You know, I think that if you talk to parents of multiple children, probably the big minefield is which kid is your favorite. But the second biggest one is, who's your smarter kid? And I think that even a lot of parents who obviously love their children equally and want to see them in the best light, I think a lot of parents will quietly acknowledge that maybe one of their kids is a little bit more talented than the other, right? That they pick things up quicker, that they have more natural aptitude. The minefield stems from the fact that if you acknowledge those things, you can certainly take them in a really ugly direction, right? So you can imagine sort of taking, an incoming group of, like, say, third graders, and you test them and you say, okay, these kids at the bottom are never going to be academic stars. So let's use less resources on them. Let's just warehouse them. Let's not give them high quality teaching. Let's not give them access to a lot of the resources that we use for education. Obviously, I think that's really ugly. However, we should acknowledge that taking those same kids who struggle academically and expecting them to meet the same standards that the most talented kids do is just as cruel, right? And it's also a waste of resources, and it's a waste of teacher attention and time. When instead what we can do is we can value those kids just as much, but we can set them with different kinds of benchmarks and metrics and tasks that play to their strengths rather than to their weaknesses. Again, I think it's a classic example, of education right now is like the man who only owns a hammer, and so he sees a world full of nails around him, right? When you only have that one tool, when your only tool are these standardized test scores and similar, then all you see is a world full of, ways to measure students by the same criteria. But if we were to be more humanistic and we were to broaden and say, you know what, like, yes, it's a valuable skill to be good at math, but it's also the valuable skill to be someone who makes friends easily, or to be someone who can be patient when they need to be, someone who can think creatively, or someone who can think critically. All these things are things that we can value. And if we can generate ways inside of our schools to value them, just like we value the ability to do algebra, for example, then I think that we create not just a more humane system for our students, but a more efficient system for our schools and our teachers as well.
How would we do that, though? How would we recognize with a university or college degree the fact that, okay, you can't do algebra, but you're a more empathetic person? Okay, you can't do calculus, but you're a more patient person. Can we recognize that with a piece of paper at the end of the day?
Well, this is the question. I mean, I think one of the things we should recognize is, the diploma is not even right now a sort of universally interpretable object. By which I mean, diplomas are already assumed to say different things about you based on where you go to school, right? A Caltech diploma is very different from a diploma from the Rhode Island School of Design. Right. And that's not just true in terms of the different degrees that people are getting, but that we make assumptions about what the institutions are doing. Now, there have been some colleges, such as Evergreen College and other places, that have done experiments with radically different grading systems. There are colleges that are in the process of retiring traditional GPA as GPA is traditionally conceived and replacing it with other kind of metrics. There's also a movement, which I find quite exciting, which some people call the badging system or the portfolio system, where instead of you going to college and you satisfy a long list of criteria that ends up with a degree, and you have the same degree as your partner next to you on the left and your partner next to you on the right, over the course of your college education, you earn different badges that indicate discrete skills, specific things that you can know or do, and that you can then go to an employer and say, hey, look, rather than saying I've just got this diploma, which means many different things, you can actually look one by one at the different things that I've been assessed on and that I've learned and that I can do. Now, that kind of change in both the schools and in the economy where they will be valued is going to take a long time. But I do think that there's a real opportunity, particularly with some of the newer technologies that we have available now, to diversify the way that we think about what it means to graduate from college, where instead of seeing everybody as just being a college degree or not, which is a very imprecise way to think about things, to instead to really disaggregate stuff and say, I'm going to assemble this set of skills, and then I can go on the market and say, here's what I can do.
Fredrik, I want to get back to this parent-child thing because I know you use the example in your book of LeBron James, who's a phenomenal basketball player, and therefore we are not surprised that his son is a pretty good basketball player as well. I'm in Canada. I'm going to use hockey for an example. Bobby Hull was a great player. We shouldn't be shocked that Brett Hull was similarly a fantastic player. Gordie Howe's in the Hall of Fame. Are we shocked that Mark Howe, his son, is also in the Hall of Fame? No, I don't think we are. The notion of educational achievement being something you'd inherit from your parents, though, is something, well, it's somewhat threatening to the whole educational system as it currently exists in North America. Yes? Tell us how and why.
Well, yeah, I mean, we have to be careful about we have to speak carefully, I guess. The degree to which I discuss some of the evidence that shows that academic ability is genetic in the book. But the degree to which that's true or is not something that I'm going to be able to figure out. It's going to take people who are way smarter than me to figure that out. But we should not foreclose on the possibility that your biological parents have a big impact on who you are academically, because we know that genetics influences everything about us as human beings. And I also think it's important to say we're already kind of operating on that assumption anyway. So, we talk a lot, sociologists talk a lot about what they call assortative mating. And assortative mating means that increasingly, as time has gone on more and more often, people are sorting into marriages and having children with people who are educationally similar to them. So if you go back 50 years ago, it was much less likely that you were going to, if you had a college degree, marry and have kids with someone who also had a college degree. As time has gone on, that dynamic has just gotten more and more and more prevalent and powerful over time, which means that we are already kind of practicing a system in which we're sorting ourselves as a country into more and more sort of by educational band. And in fact, one of the big stories of the 2020 election is that by many metrics, your educational status, whether you have a high school diploma or a college diploma, master's degrees, whatever, that this has become a more politically determinative metric about you than your race. Right? So in other words, more and more often now, we are seeing that people are grouping themselves by education rather than race. And so we've already got a situation in the United States where we're paying a ton of attention to who we are educationally and choosing partners and co-parents on that metric. And so I think one of the things we need to do is speak frankly about that condition and begin to explore what it means, rather than ignoring it because we find it uncomfortable, because it's not going to get any better, or things aren't going to get examined if we just pretend like this is a conversation we don't want to have.
Well, I do find this fascinating because, for the last half century, we've been telling everybody it's all about merit. You're only going to get anywhere you're going to get in this world if you are meritorious and are credentialed and deserve to get there. And now we've got your book. Michael Sandel was on this program from Harvard not too long ago, talking about the tyranny of merit. And I want to make sure I understand what you're saying, that even if our meritocratic systems of education were better at including greater numbers of students from populations that are historically discriminated, that a meritocracy fulfilled would even be more cruel than what we have now? Can you explain that to me?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I would look at it is this, right? We very righteously, I think, have in recent decades begun the work, although we're far from finished, of reducing the impact of racial category on people's life outcomes. And we have done so because we recognize that the race that you are born into is not under your control and is an arbitrary distinction that is unjust to reward with poverty or wealth or whatever. And that's an important advancement that we're sort of stumblingly, slowly making as a civilization. The thing that I want people to think through, though, is if it is in fact true that there is such a thing as a natural aptitude for school, for academics, and thus a natural aptitude for having a white collar job that earns a lot of money, right? If that is in fact something that is innate to you, at least partially innate or intrinsic to you, then that having that ability is just as arbitrary as the racial category into which you fall, right? If you don't choose it, if you can't control it, if your parents conceive you and then you end up having to live out the consequences of either a lack of talent or having talent, then how can we say that that's any more fair or any more legitimate or just than if we are a racist society in which people's arbitrary racial category also impacts them negatively? The more that we believe that something is innate, the less we can fairly say that you deserve your outcomes based on that factor.
And one of the remedies you have for this, and let's put it on the record right here, you say it in the book, you are a self-avowed Marxist, and you believe that there are some versions in a communist society that could address the problem of inequality as we've discussed it here today. Maybe you could amplify a bit on that and tell us how you think that would work.
Yeah, I mean, I would avoid the term communism because it's very loaded and it's historically complicated. And I'm not sure that as much as I self-identify with the Marxist philosophy, I don't know that communism can be ported into 21st century conditions where things have changed very deeply, particularly in terms of the knowledge economy. But I do think that a vastly more redistributive system in which we are generating a lot of wealth and productivity, and rather than just distributing it to people based on a market economy, but rather creating a deeper sense of shared prosperity in which we are guaranteeing certain minimal living conditions for everyone, is a fairer one. Because again, if we think genes matter, if we think things are innate, then it becomes really hard to morally justify, for example, someone who was born without a lot of talent for things that are marketable now, that person's poverty. Once upon a time, being able to carry a big heavy rock around make you a lot of money, right? A couple thousand years ago, if you were the biggest, strongest warrior, you were the guy with the biggest muscles, then that was something that was very marketable. Nowadays, if you're that person and that's your thing, if you're not good at school, if you're not a scientist, if you're not good at computers, but your thing is being big and strong, right? Most of what you used to be able to do has been replaced by machines, and maybe you go and you become a laborer and you make $12 an hour, right? So why is it that we would reward that person 2,000 years ago with riches and prestige, but now that same person is somebody who is going to be on the unemployment line and on food stamps? How can we say that this person who has the same general level of ability, that the person who happened to be born 2,000 years ago, he was a hero, while the person here is someone who needs to be the beneficiary of the state. The moral justification for that is perfectly fickle, right? This person who lives now is just unlucky enough to be born in a time in which it's not valuable to have his characteristics. And I think we should especially think about this because with the rise of artificial intelligence, a lot of the professions right now that are very remunerative, that are very valuable, are going to be replaced by machines, right? So in other words, being a coder, being a programmer right now is a fantastically well-paying position. But there's going to be a time when the code is written by code, right? And AI is doing the job that coders do now. So if you're born now, it's lucky to have those skills. Maybe in 150 years, those skills are no longer marketable because computers are doing it anyway. And so we have to think about the fact that what is rewarded in the economy is fickle and changes over time. And if that's true, then in my opinion, we shouldn't punish people for having to be born with the wrong skills.
I take your point, but there's a political follow-up question here that I need some help with. And that is, many of the people that you're talking about right now are not choosing a socialist alternative. We heard Donald Trump actually in the last election campaign talk about how much he loves the uneducated. If he is supposedly, I guess, the sort of revenge against the smarty pants set, why are the people that you are purporting to speak for here following him instead of your option?
Well, I think you have to look at sort of the distribution of these ideas. I mean, you're absolutely right about who sort of is voicing these various ideas. But again, like the economy is kind of fickle, right? And it changes quickly. And people who thought that they were doing the right thing all of a sudden find out that they're not being rewarded. So here in the United States, we had for a very long time, this idea of like the factory at the edge of town job, right? Where you didn't have to have a college degree. You could just have a college diploma. You go to the factory at the edge of town. You would not be rich, but you could get a job where you work your 40 hours a week, and you could own a home, raise a family, own a car, etc. That lifestyle has largely died out for a variety of reasons. Big one being automation, right? We manufacture a ton of stuff in the United States, but manufacturing employs a small fraction of the number of people it used to employ because we have robots and machines that do the things that human beings used to do. The people who were employed in those positions are the kind of people who once would have gone to work at the factory at the edge of town job. These tend to be people who are Donald Trump style supporters. And I think their anger is reflected at the fact that their parents were able to sort of work according to that social contract and have stable, economically secure lives. And many of them can't do that same thing anymore because the economy changed. And the economy changed in the economic favor of people like me who have college degrees and who work in a knowledge economy and who live in urban centers like I live in Brooklyn. And so there's a lot of resentment towards the ideas that come out of from people like me, and some of it is justified. I think ultimately, I hope that the dynamic that you're describing, but if it does change, it has to come from a broadening community understanding that there are forces in the economy that change everybody's outcomes that are not under our control. I don't share Andrew Yang's politics. So Andrew Yang, who was the Democratic presidential candidate in 2020 and is now a candidate for mayor here in New York. But, he does have a vision of the economy where he says, like, look, if you look at the long-term trend over time, a fewer and fewer percentage of Americans are involved in the formal economy. And that's just, that number has gone down steadily. And so you're creating this class of people who are just totally outside of the formal economy and they don't really have a place in the society. And he's identifying the fact that, there are long-term structural changes to how our economy works and our deal works that is outside of the control of individuals. And at some point, we have to start to think about the fact that it's sort of assuming that everybody's economic outcomes are under their control. It becomes a very cruel thing.
You've given us a lot to think about. And Fredrik deBoer, we appreciate you coming on TVO tonight to talk about The Cult of Smart, your newest book. Take good care and thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.